Over the last several years, Pokemon games have been getting more and more expensive, and I'm sure you've been wondering, why? Well, simple. Idiots like me are buying sealed copies of these games and grading them. Thanks for watching. I'm kidding, of course, but Pokemon games have been getting more expensive. Let's just take a look at some of these games at random. The Gen 1 Pokemon games are going for around $50 each, and those are the cheapest. Pokemon Crystal goes for around $100. Pokemon Black 2 goes for $150, and loose copies of Pokemon Emerald are going for as much as $200. And those are just the loose cartridge copies. Complete and box copies are going for way more than that. Sometimes hundreds of dollars more than that. Why is that? Why are they so expensive? I mean, these games sold millions of copies each, so they're not rare, but they are expensive. Why? Well, there is a very simple, if inconvenient explanation: supply and demand. Pokemon is the single largest franchise in the world. In fact, it makes more money than Star Wars and Marvel combined. It is a ginormous moneymaker. People love it all across the world. Millions, possibly hundreds of millions of Pokemon fans exist, and, well, Pokemon fans always want more Pokemon, especially older Pokemon stuff. There are a lot of Pokemon fans nowadays. I mean, there's still Pokemon fans that are just entering the franchise with the release of Scarlet and Violet. I mean, Scarlet and Violet have been out for less than a year now, the latest Pokemon games, and have already sold almost 25 million units. I'm willing to bet that quite a few of those went to brand new Pokemon fans who have never played the games before. And there's going to be those fans who enter the franchise and realize, wow, this series is actually kind of fun. I want to go back and try some of the older games. And then there's people like me who grew up in the 90s and thus grew up with Pokemon, who want to gather up some old nostalgia and have some fun with the old Pokemon games like we used to 20, 30 years ago. There's always the ability to play these older games with an emulator or with a bootleg cartridge that doesn't cost you an arm and a leg, but people want the real deal. If I wanted to, I could take Pokemon from this copy of Emerald and transfer them to this copy of Pokemon Soul Silver, and then up to this copy of Pokemon Black 2, and eventually I could transfer those Pokemon all the way up to the present day in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, and you just aren't able to do that unless you own authentic cartridges for these older games. And there's plenty of other reasons why people want the authentic experience, and the reasons don't really matter. The fact is, people want authentic Pokemon cartridges, so prices go up. Let's take a look at Pokemon Emerald as an example. Emerald sold about 7 million copies total, which is not a small number. In fact, Emerald is the third best-selling games on the Game Boy Advance, which seems like a lot, but there are a lot more than just 7 million people who want a copy of Emerald nowadays. According to Bulbapedia, about 2 million copies of Emerald are Japanese copies, which means that there's only about 5 million left across all the other regions of the world. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that there's about 4 million that are in English, okay? 4 million copies of Emerald in English. How many of those over the last 20 years have been lost or damaged or just straight up destroyed, thus shrinking the supply even further? I wouldn't be surprised if there were only about 3.5 million copies of Emerald right now that are in English in a condition that people are able to play with, and yeah, suddenly it doesn't seem like that much, does it? Especially for a Pokemon game that a lot of people consider one of the must-own versions of the whole series. And that's just right now. You know, over the last 20 years, how many have been lost or damaged? Well, how many in the next 20 years are going to be lost and damaged? How many more Pokemon fans are going to show up in the next 20 years? The franchise shows no signs of slowing down. In fact, if anything, since the pandemic began, it has just grown more and more popular because more people are getting into it. And again, that doesn't even count for things such as complete in-box copies. I mean, there are always going to be far fewer complete in-box copies of these Pokemon games than loose cartridges for obvious reasons. You know, in the 90s and 2000s, when most kids got a game like this, you know what they did with the box? They threw it in the garbage. So if you want these Pokemon games complete in box, especially for older games with cardboard boxes, you need to expect to pay a pretty penny in order to get them, especially in good condition. There's also just more Pokemon fans who want to own every single Pokemon game, such as me. You see that wall behind me? I own every single Pokemon game complete in box, including the spin-offs. So yeah, there's more and more people who are like me who just want to own every single Pokemon game. So it doesn't matter if you already own Pokemon Gold, you're going to want to own Pokemon Silver and Pokemon Crystal. So that just shrinks the supply even more as more and more people, whether you want to call them shelf collectors or speculators or what have you, just grab up so many copies of these games for themselves in their own personal collections. And if you're a game collector who is also tired of not being able to find good deals anymore, make sure that you're subscribed because I am going to be making a video soon about that very topic. For the older Pokemon games, basically anything from before the 3DS era, people are willing to pay a little more money in order to ensure that it's an authentic copy of those games. The Gen 3 Pokemon games on Game Boy Advance are the most faked video games ever. I mean, there are easily many times more fake copies of Pokemon Ruby and Fire Red and Emerald than there are authentic copies. And for people who are wanting to make sure they own the real deal, they're willing to pay the price to make sure theirs is real instead of pay $20 and it turns out to not be the real deal, that it's a fake. As a rule of thumb on eBay, if it is cheap, then it's probably too good to be true. Let's take a look at Soul Silver here. Oftentimes on eBay, a loose cartridge of this goes for over $100, but there's also plenty of listings right now for $10, $15, $20, and that might seem appealing because why would I spend $100 when there's a listing right there for $20? Well, it's because those are fake. Those are not real copies of the game. Will they work? Probably, but they're not the real deal, and to collectors and to anyone who cares about Pokemon, it needs to be real. And if you want the real deal, you gotta pay up. It's worth mentioning that most of the expensive games are actually third versions or remakes. Basically the versions that fans consider the best of the games. So if you want to play the Gen 2 games for cheap, just get yourself a loose copy of Pokemon Silver. You can get this for only $30 or $40, which I think is very reasonable. You don't need to spend $100 for Pokemon Crystal. You don't need to spend $100 for Pokemon Soul Silver. You can just get a good old copy of Silver for, you know, a lot cheaper than that, that's for sure. But people want Soul Silver, they want Crystal version, because those are the definitive versions of Gen 2. They feel like if you're just settling for Gold or Silver, you're missing out on some of the experience. Even though I disagree, Silver is my favorite Pokemon game of all time, that's why I got it slabbed. It's also worth mentioning that pretty much this whole video is just talking about the English versions of these games. You can still get foreign language games, especially Japanese copies, for really cheap. I got this complete in-box copy of Pokemon Leaf Green for only $20, and you can regularly find loose cartridges of every single game for cheaper than that. But people want English for obvious reasons. It is worth mentioning that the Japanese games for everything prior to the 3DS will work just fine in North American Game Boys and DS's. There's nothing wrong with playing a different language copy. It's fully compatible, it'll do trades, all that stuff. Just saying. It's also worth mentioning that there's quite a few of these games that are just more expensive from the get-go. I mean, taking this as an example, this is a copy of Pokemon Shield that has the expansion pass right there on the cartridge. You don't need to pay for the digital DLC. This retailed for $90 when it came out. Basically the price of the game plus the DLC, you don't get a discount. So people didn't really buy it because a lot of people already owned the game and owned the DLC and didn't see a point in getting it complete on the cartridge. They didn't even make many of these. As far as my research shows, they made somewhere around maybe 500,000 of them, somewhere around those lines. And it doesn't really matter how many they made because this didn't sell all that well because people didn't really want it. So when it finally did sell out, all of a sudden, the demand went up. Now, this regularly goes for around $150, and it's just going to continue going up, especially years from now when the Nintendo eShop closes down, and the only way to play the Isle of Armor and Crown Tundra DLCs is by owning this very cartridge. Let's take a look at Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which were pretty notorious back when they first released for being expensive. If you were lucky to buy one at retail, great, no trouble whatsoever. But the problem is a lot of retailers just didn't order enough of them, and the one retailer that did was GameStop, and I will never forgive Reddit for saving them. What GameStop almost always did with these games is they got their shipment in, they opened up the games, and then they sold the cartridges as used for 60 bucks. And people bought it because that was the only way to get these games unless you pre-ordered it or were able to get it really close to release. Even just a year after Heart Gold and Soul Silver released, they were already going for an inflated amount, and they've just been going up ever since. So basically, there's a lot more reasons that Pokemon games have gone up in price than just greedy sealed collectors, or the pandemic jacking up prices, or people spending their stimulus checks on needless things. There's a lot more reasons than that. This whole video has been me going over just the reasons I can think of, and there's probably more that I just can't. Which I guess leads to the question of, can you still get old Pokemon games for cheap? Can you still find a copy of Emerald or a copy of Pokemon Black 2 that doesn't cost you $100, that you could just get for 10 or 20? And the answer is yes. But you have to put in a lot of work, and you have to get really lucky. Game stores know what they're selling. You're never going to go into a game store that has a Pokemon game on sale and they don't know what it's worth. They're going to do their research, they're going to price it competitively, and they're probably going to sell it before you leave the store, whether it's you buying it or not. And if you go to a yard sale or a flea market or something like that, if you do find an authentic copy of the game, the owners aren't stupid. They know what they have. They're probably going to sell it for around what it goes for on eBay. Every once in a while, you might get lucky and find someone who is just willing to let their game go for a few bucks, but that's about your best bet. You're just not going to find Pokemon games on the cheap anymore. It's just not possible. So if you are a Pokemon fan who wants to play Pokemon games, you're just going to have to accept that sacrifices will have to be made. Either you're going to have to just play the games on an emulator, or you're going to have to fork over a lot of money in order to play the real deal. There is not much of a middle ground between those two. So pick your poison. In the meantime, if you want to future-proof yourself, if you're thinking, I don't need a copy of Brilliant Diamond, I already have a copy of Shining Pearl, you might consider going and getting the one that you're missing. 25 years from now, these prices are probably going to be pretty close to what the older games are right now. And just between you and me, these games are out of print, so once they're sold out of stores, that's it. So get them all you can. So that'll bring this video to an end. Thanks everyone for watching. I am very happy that the price that I paid for these older Pokemon games is a lot less than what they're going for these days. I pity anyone who's trying to get into collecting all these games now. It cannot be easy. I wish you all the best of luck. Let me know what Pokemon games you have in the comments and if you're hoping to pick up more in the future. Thanks everyone for watching, and stay tuned for more.